Hello, firebrands, provocateurs, truthsayers, and agitators. Welcome to another episode of Memoir Nation. It is summer, so happy summer, of course. But Grant, here in Berkeley, per usual, it has been cold and shitty so far, basically. Like, we are recording this in July, so maybe by the time we get to August, I can stop complaining about our weather. But seriously, every summer, I do feel cheated. Like, cheated out of summer. I'm longing for hot days while the rest of the country is in a heat wave, and then feeling guilty for complaining about being freezing while people are having heat strokes. And this year, of course, these horrible fires. So maybe I should shut up.
It's funny, Brooke, because I remember having this conversation last year with you, about our different climactic dispositions, because I actually love the fog and the coolness we get here. I have the same conversation with my wife, Heather, every year as well, because she grew up in Arizona. And I know you must have SoCal, baked into your cells. And I have to say that I just spent 2 very humid and sticky weeks in New York, and it was a painful transition coming back here, or a painful transition going there, rather. But I kind of got into it in the end because, as you said, it's nice to feel the summer in its fullness, even when that fullness is uncomfortable, as long as it's uncomfortable with heat. And I will say that I saw some amazing fireflies dancing in the darkness, which we just don't get here in the fog. But I think this is a good episode for you to just say it how it is, and to air your complaints and even your grievances, because we're done being nice here, except to fireflies.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And yes, I am super done being nice. I really don't want to apologize for being such a complainer, but I do complain a lot. It's actually a little bit of a hallmark of my personality because I want things to be better, from the country to the weather to people's behavior. But then when you complain, you can draw the attention of people who think that you shouldn't be such a complainer or that you shouldn't be so mean.
Maybe I just take your complaints in stride without noticing them, Brooke. I don't know, because I never think of you as a complainer, and certainly not mean. But I hear what you're saying about just wanting things to be better, and I think the challenge is that we often conflate meanness with honesty in our culture. And I feel like in other countries, people are more blunt and to the point, and it's just the way it is. And I once read an article about British culture once, and how it operates with a kind of energetic debate that is a vital part of it. And in fact, debate is expected. Whereas here in the States, some states over others, of course, there's a culture of nice, but it's really just covering up for so many things. And as you know, I've talked about the ethos of Iowa nice, as they call it, where I grew up. And I admire that ethos, but at the same time, I hate it because it's often, a better word for it is Iowa conflict avoidant.
Right.
And if someone gets in a political argument, for example, someone might say, it's best not to talk about politics or religion. And I actually think it is best to talk about politics and religion. And, we're in the business of talking about so much more obviously, and pushing discourse in every possible way through people's personal stories. So I think it's good to be nice, but I like to think you can be nice and expressive and confrontational and talk about challenging and uncomfortable topics all at the same time.
Absolutely. And I mean, I come from California and we don't have Iowa nice and SoCal. I think we have like standoffishness as a default. So I sort of think I'm nicer than most people know. We could talk about kindness, right? I think a lot of people are like, I'm not nice, I'm kind. I think that is absolutely true of our 2 guests that we have paired this time around. I want to talk about this because, Roxane Gay and Myriam Gurba, they both have that kind of personality. I mean, I don't think of either one of them as not nice per se, but they can certainly have an edge, and they can be, quote unquote mean. And they certainly have points of intersection in their writing. And so I want to talk about it like as a brand of writing, because they are both like kind of caustic in a way that I absolutely love. Of course, in their interviews, they were incredibly generous and very interesting. And I think they're both 2 of my favorite writers, honestly. I just find them so arresting in a way that is exciting and interesting. And so even though we had very different conversations, of course, with 2 very different guests, it did feel like these 2 could have been in conversation with one another. And I think that's how we end up putting these mashups together, Grant, when we just like see in the other, something that kind of clicks and makes sense.
Yeah, and that would be such a great event to have them in conversation. So I hope it happens someday if it hasn't happened already, because both of them have built entire careers on refusing to be nice. And again, like not unkind, like you said, but not nice or trying to be. And of course, one of Myriam's books is actually called Mean. And our topic with Roxane was memoir as manifesto. And no one is thinking about niceness when they approach someone's manifesto. And neither Roxane or Myriam are writing for other people's comfort. And Roxane doesn't even talk on podcasts for other people's comfort because she took us on a couple of different directions we didn't even expect.
I agree. That's like one of the things that I love about Roxane is like when you talk with her, you know you're going to get her honest take. And Roxane and Myriam have done something similar in their writing styles as well, in that they're not just telling stories, but they're making arguments, and they clearly have something to say and a point that they're trying to make. And this is a hallmark of Roxane's writing, you know, whether it's in her books or her essays or her commentary, she does want you to know exactly what she thinks about something, and she is exacting and unsparing, and it's exactly why people love her. And so after the revelations about Cesar Chavez, you know, which was just another thing in a long line of BS post-Epstein files and Trump predatory behavior and on, she wrote this. I saw this on Facebook. It said, "Men make it really hard to respect them, believe them, or even tolerate them. This Cesar Chavez business has me fucked up, and it reminds me of how even in progressive spaces, women are disposable and given little consideration. Yeah, not all men, but come on, it's enough that you all should talk to one another and figure out how to fix yourselves." So this is just very Roxane. You know, she does make you think. She's not trying to be careful. She's not trying to not hurt people's feelings. She is saying things like they are. And I really admire that a lot, because even though I speak my mind, I can tend toward being very diplomatic and even-handed. And I'm always seeing both sides of everything. And so sometimes I just love an exacting person like Roxane, who's like, nope, this is bullshit. It's very refreshing. But of course, it gets a lot of pushback too.
Yeah, it definitely does. And of course, I agree with that sentiment, you know, and I love how she says, men, you just need to get together and fix this,
Right.
because men do need to talk to one another. And I've talked with you, Brooke, about the man problem and the many ways I see it showing up, and I'm troubled and confused and at loose ends. And I have to say, I don't entirely understand it. And I'm a man myself. So if someone wants to give me funding, I'll gladly organize a big meeting for us all to figure out how to fix ourselves. As Roxane said, I think giving voice matters so much. And I like that word you're using, Brooke, incisive. And the reason we partnered these two writers together for this summer mashup is because Myriam is equally incisive. I know she came on your radar in the aftermath of the American Dirt scandal, and we'll share about that in the interview clips. But she had a lot to lose by putting her thoughts out there. And boy, did she not mince words when it came to her feelings about that book. Her essay was actually called Mendeja, You Ain't Steinbeck, My Bronco with Fake-Ass Social Justice Literature. So that kind of says it all. She's going for it.
I know. I love that. I have to say it again just because it makes me laugh.
Yeah.
Pendeja, you ain't Steinbeck. My bronca with fake ass social justice literature. I mean, when I saw that essay, I was just like, I was dying. It's such a good essay. And you know what? Sometimes you got to love a takedown because sometimes it is merited.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing that's here in these episodes is a willingness to confront hard issues. Both Roxane and Myriam, they circle trauma in their writing, and a lot of trauma actually, and they're not afraid to bring that to the fore in addition to all the honesty, and sometimes with a dose of meanness, especially toward people who we as readers might see as deserving that meanness.
Yeah, for sure. You know, Roxane was actually the one who said that the best book she'd read in all of 2025 was Careless People. And you and I, well, after that, like long after Roxane's interview, it was resurfaced for me, which is something that you and I talked about in a recent book trend that people can go back and look if you just, you know, look for all things memoir and Careless People. But I have to say, like, I probably wouldn't have ever gotten it in the first place if it hadn't been for Roxane. And she kind of inspired us, I think, to basically do the All Things memoir to talk about what Mark Zuckerberg had done, which is basically trying to silence Sarah Williams, the author, by enforcing what is essentially like a mandate that she can't publicize her book. And so that's the kind of thing that I can get really, really passionate about in terms of wanting to cover it and put more exposure on it and get people to buy the book. And so in those kinds of cases, I can really relate to Roxane and her fire. And I was really grateful that she was the one who recommended it. We do, of course, recommend that everybody reads the book. And I can see why she loves it, because it's essentially a takedown of really shitty people. And if you think about it, people like Roxane and Myriam are the truth tellers, who are being accused of being mean because they're pulling down the curtain on other people's shitty behavior, which is exactly what Sarah Wynne Williams is doing with Facebook. And so we need writers like that. We need people who are going to provoke and agitate and not be afraid, because otherwise it's the people with the power, whose narratives are winning out.
Completely. And they're inspiring to others because they forge a path and set an example for truth telling. And not all of us are going to write that way, nor can we. But we need, smart, incisive voices more than ever, people who are lighting a path of truth. And it's not easy, nor do you often get a whole lot of accolades for doing so, which is interesting. But Roxane and Myriam, they are beloved, but they also have plenty of detractors. So being a truth teller is not without its challenges. And yet they stay the course because they must.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we are bringing these two amazing women to you this summer, two of our favorite Memoir Nation guests from the past year. Actually, of course, we were lucky enough to interview Roxane twice this year, Grant, which was a pretty special treat. As always, we encourage you listeners to go back into the archives, listen to past episodes. Meanwhile, we hope you enjoyed these clips of these two interviews. And if you love them a lot, you can go back and listen to the full episodes. So we'll start with Roxane Gay. Welcome, Roxane.
Thank you so much, Brooke.
Super thrilled to have you. And I want to get right into the first writing question I have that I've been wanting to ask you about. In Hunger, you write, I am using my voice not just for myself, but for people whose lives demand being seen and heard. And I think this is such a really powerful and important sentiment because, writers who have clarity, that what they're doing is a service, or an agenda or a mission are really particular kind of writers. And I wanted to ask you how you think about this or how your ideas about, writing as service or, for others who can't use their own voice maybe has morphed over the years.
One of the main ways in which my thinking around writing and voice has evolved is certainly that I do write for all kinds of people. I write first and foremost for myself, but I also write for, the people who don't get to be heard. But one of the many things I've learned over the course of my career is that no one's voiceless. They may not have opportunities to use their voices, but they have a voice. And so I try to be mindful of that in all of my work.
Well, Roxane, you share so many deeply personal things, and you wrote that Hunger was the hardest book to write. I'm not sure if that remains the case, and I'll let you say more on that. But my question is about how much memoirists share or should share. And I'm probing this personally in my own memoir, my first memoir. I think about it every time I write it. And I was wondering if you think readers expect more from memoirists now, that we mind the depths of our lived experience and that nothing should be off limits or very little should be off limits?
I think readers are greedy and they want everything. And it is our job as memoirists to resist and to only disclose what we can tolerate disclosing, it's not necessarily what feels safe, but what we can handle the world knowing about us. Vulnerability is incredibly important, and some would say it's a hallmark of my memoir nonfiction writing. And it's difficult to be vulnerable on the page, but the reason I'm able to do it is because I do have firm boundaries over what I'm willing to say and what I'm willing to share publicly. And it's just incredibly important that everyone have firm boundaries. And a lot of times, I think boundaries are the thing that most people struggle the most with, but we have to work on at least on the page, being able to maintain those boundaries. Because once you put work out into the world, you have no control over what people are going to do with it, how they're going to judge the decisions that you've made and the way that you've lived your life. And so prepare yourself and protect yourself. And I also believe that we've seen, especially in recent years, what happens when people disclose too much. Several months ago, I read a memoir that's recently out that I think exemplifies what happens when you over-disclose, and radical oversharing kind of loses the plot. And so there are times when people over-disclose. And the reality is it's not the end of the world. It isn't. And some people love that. Some people love all the gory details. And good for them, but gory details do not necessarily translate into good writing. And so I always encourage memoirists to remember that you should only disclose what's going to enhance the story that you're trying to tell.
Really good advice. And, here we are, Roxane. I mean, I know that you follow a lot of pop culture and what's going on in the culture in general. And I imagine you've seen a little bit of the blowout from the Liz Gilbert memoir in the past week. And I'm really curious about your take on fallout in general. Not necessarily that you have to give us all the Liz Gilbert takes, but more just about the fact that this seems to me to be particularly gendered, that when a woman writes a memoir, and I'm interested too what you said about oversharing, because perhaps she did. But I wondered, because you came to mind as a person, who probably suffered from some fallout in the aftermath of your own memoirs. And, just if you might say more about that.
Well, that is the memoir I was referring to in the previous question. The book is not good. And I say that while respecting Gilbert's talent. She's an amazing writer, and anyone who says otherwise is lying. It's all subjective, but much of her body of work is genuinely excellent. She knows how to craft a beautiful sentence. That craft is not readily apparent in the new book. I'm not sure what happened there. There are, of course, some characteristically nice sentences, but they're surrounded by a lot of over-disclosure, just unrepentant navel-gazing, and the poetry is ill-advised. The drawings are ill-advised. But I suspect she made the book she wanted, because she's certainly at a point in her career where she can. And she is a nice person. I don't know her personally, but I have collaborated with her professionally, and she's very generous. And so any critique I offer is genuinely just of the book. And I find the fallout to be a little unhinged. I think that people wait until they see vulnerability in popular writers, and then they all jump on, because they didn't have the courage to do it when they really first felt those thoughts, if they felt them. And so I'm interested in that. I'm actually writing about it in my review of the book, because I have seen people diagnosed with a range of mental illnesses, and I really don't care for when people armchair diagnose people simply because they don't like them, or they don't like their work, they don't like how they live their lives. That's not inherently mental illness. And when you sort of armchair diagnose, that's you telling the world that you can't find your words. You don't have the adequate language skills to express what you really want to say. So you want to put this person in a mental illness container. It's not great. I don't think we should do it. And we've all done it from time to time, but the older I get, the more mindful I am of recognizing what I don't know. You don't know. Maybe she's got some stuff going on, but it's not the point. And either you're talking about the book or you're talking about her as a person. And unfortunately, more people are talking about the writer than they are about the book. And frankly, most of the people talking about the book haven't read it.
Right. Because it just came out the week that everybody is talking about it. And I had to laugh, though, with the New York Times, because I had just read your book, Hunger, and then I read the Times piece that dinged Liz for not citing Grey's Anatomy for using my person. And of course, you use my person a lot, and you say you love Grey's Anatomy, but you don't cite Grey's Anatomy. And it just seemed like one of those insane asides.
And it was meant to be funny. I thought it was very good in that it was fair. It was honest. It was accurate. The Times review, clearly the author read the book. The Grey's Anatomy aside, I took as a joke. Because, like, why, at this point, person as romantic partner has been in the vernacular for so long that everyone knows it's from Grey's Anatomy. And you no longer need to, like, cite that as a source because it's common wisdom.
Fair enough. That's a good reframe.
Roxane, Brooke and I were talking about your work and the style of work that you do. And because of Brooke's history at Seal Press, the idea of memoir as manifesto came up. And I was curious what your thoughts are if someone calls your work a manifesto or a polemic or any other of these other terms that suggest you are making an argument or taking a position on something. And actually Googled memoir manifestos, and Bad Feminist was one of the top results. So I'm curious if you like that, or do you think otherwise, or of what you're working to achieve?
It depends on which book you're talking about. Like, I don't consider Bad Feminist a memoir at all. I think of it as an essay collection of cultural criticism. And I certainly draw from the personal in some of the essays, but that is definitely, if not a manifesto, it is an argument. I think memoir can be a manifesto. Arundhati Roy, I think, gets into that territory. I don't think you could look at any writer and say all of their work is memoir manifesto, because generally we tend to have different projects from one book to the next in terms of what we want to achieve with the book, what we want the reader to receive from the book.
Yeah, it's helpful. What about Hunger, just out of curiosity, more traditional memoir?
That's definitely a memoir. I can see why people would read it as manifesto, because I was certainly arguing in the book for more cultural nuance when it comes to understanding the experience of living in a fat body and looking at all of the cultural ideas we have around fatness that are incredibly toxic.
Right. So there are arguments in there, and they're great ones, of course. It's a good segue to my next question, which is about shame. You probably won't be surprised to hear that shame comes up a lot as a topic on this show. Memoirists, it seems, don't really get to do what they do without dipping themselves in shame baths. And you write pretty eloquently and honestly about shame and hunger. And I was a little honestly surprised at the depth of it, since your public persona is so, badass, for lack of a better, more creative word. And I was curious if you could share the impact of sharing your shame and whether it released some of it for you or made it better in any way or not.
Yeah, it's difficult to write about shame. That requires the vulnerability we were talking about earlier. And so I can't say that it necessarily released any, but there is some relief in admitting I'm carrying this shame. I'm very fortunate in that while I certainly harbor shame about some things, I don't live my life drowning in it. But so many people experience shame and carry it in silence, and they feel like it's a solitary experience. And if I can let one person know through Hunger, for example, that you are not alone in having shame, and that the real shame is not you, but anyone who has harmed you. Like, that's where the shame lies. And if I can help people even temporarily redirect shame, then I feel like I've done some reasonably good work.
Roxane, our final question for you is, it's interesting because I actually started following you on Twitter. I want to say it was 2008 or 2009. I know it was before you were famous. And in reading Hunger, you share about how you got into the online world at a fairly early point in the internet, and that the internet for you gave you anonymity. And then later you said about writing that one of the things you love about it is that anyone can write. Your looks don't matter. And again, you mentioned the anonymity. But of course, now you're you're the opposite of anonymous. You're, very public, and I assume you get recognized everywhere you go. And I was curious when I was reading about some of the invisibility you felt before you got famous, and I was curious about the contrast of being invisible and then so visible and anonymous and so well known. In what ways does your visibility impact your writing, and whether that's your actual writing or your writing habits?
I don't think of myself as visible, but I certainly do recognize that I am at a stage of my career where more people know me than the average writer, because, for most of us, when we write, we toil in relative obscurity, and that's okay because, you love the writing. So the fact that I can get recognized is alarming in many ways, because I'm a writer. I never intended to be in front of like the proverbial camera. And so while it hasn't necessarily affected my writing, it has made me a little more cautious, which I don't like. And it's made me cautious for a few reasons. One, people offer very little margin for error. Liz Gilbert's current situation reflects that. And I write about this in Bad Feminist, like, don't put me on a pedestal. But oftentimes people love to put public figures, and I don't include myself in that public figure part, but people love to put public figures on pedestals and wait for them to do something disappointing and then tear them down. And I'm not sure what it is in human nature that encourages us to do that, but we do it. And so I feel a lot of pressure to have every opinion and every argument that I make be perfect, when perfect is not the goal, and perfect is actually a very problematic idea anyway. So it's challenging, and I have to get out of my own way these days. And that's frustrating because it hampers the writing.
Well, thanks for all of that, Roxane. It's super insightful and great to have you on with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Roxane, thank you so much. I think you are a public figure. When I saw you at AWP behind the pank table after you'd really taken off, I was like, wow, Roxane Gay is still doing the pank table.
Oh, forever. Now I'm going to be doing the rumpus table. I can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you for buying the rumpus.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you for that. And now, Myriam Gurba.
Holy cow, Myriam. I am so excited to have you. Thank you for being on with us today.
Yay! Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Oh, good. It's been a long time coming for us. You've been on our wish list for a while, so this is great. And, one of the really cool things about doing this show is that Grant and I get immersed in someone's writing, especially rooting around for what we think the theme of the show would be. And I got turned on to your work actually in the aftermath of the American Dirt scandal saga. And we can talk about that a little bit later, but I read some of your essays at that time. But then in preparation for today, I read Mean and Creep back to back.
That's a lot.
It is a lot, but I've got it and was up for it for sure. And then a little bit of your new book, Poppy State, that is coming out in October, which you graciously sent to me. And what I kept coming back to over and over again is your language. Like your language, your choice of words is so stunning, often surprising, fun, playful, shocking. And so I just wanted to start here. If you could talk about word choice and how much of that just flows from your expression, or how much of it is around like you doing revision and mulling over how you want to say something.
Wow, I'm so impressed that you read Mean and Creep back to back. I'm surprised you're not in therapy right now.
I couldn't get enough. It was awesome, actually. I highly recommend it.
Those are really intense books. And thank you for the compliment on my use of language. I really appreciate it. I think it's appropriate to say that I'm in love with language. I don't know if language is in love with me, but but I'm in love with it, and it's been a lifelong romance. And I think that that's partially my dad's fault, because he's trained as a linguist. And so language and thinking about language and talking about language were very common activities in the house where I grew up. And a lot of the humor that I was first exposed to, like the humor in our household, was word-based humor. A lot of it was punning. And I thought that everybody's family was like that. I thought that everybody sat around and punned with their families. And then I learned that that was not the case, that some people really don't appreciate that. But as far as the way that the words come in the process of writing, often they come to me in a really intuitive way, but there is also a lot of shaping and pruning and replacement that happens during the editing phase. I really enjoy revision and I really enjoy editing. And part of my editing process is also highly auditory. I read everything that I write aloud to myself until I get a just right feeling in the pit of my stomach. And I don't consider work finished until I get that sensation. And so I read my work compulsively, and I read it over and over and over. And it has such an effect that it imprints the narrative, and I often have my narratives memorized as a result of that reading and rereading.
Wow. Well, in keeping with Brooke's observation about your language, you're obviously a literary writer, and you've been called a dynamic literary voice. And I'm just curious about how you relate to the word literary for a couple different reasons. I mean, one is that literary often is synonymous with doesn't sell well. But then for me, it's kind of the category. Like I've often not liked or been uncomfortable with the description of literary fiction because it carries some elitist baggage, and it's sometimes positioned as other or better than other genres. So it kind of comes with a gate that can feel hard to open, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a snobby word, but at the same time, it is a word that I embrace. I like the word, and I'm partial to the word, and I will use it on occasion. But I don't necessarily use the word to describe my own work. But I do like the word. I also think that the word has a campy quality to it. And I'm very attracted to camp. I always have been. I was even a campy child. I love campy children. And so for me, invoking the notion of the literary intersects with camp. And so in that regard, I do kind of embrace it.
That's so interesting, Myriam. I wonder if you could say a little bit more for our listeners who don't really, I'm imagining some of our listeners might not know exactly what you mean by that. And because you have such interesting word associations, I wonder if you could just take that a little bit farther, like the whole literary camp thing, because I'm curious to know more too.
Sure. So I'm thinking specifically of Susan Sontag's notes on camp and the way in which sort of camp refers to artifice that almost transcends artifice because it is so artificial.
I gotcha.
And so the word literary suggests that to me, something that is so overwrought that it almost transcends the overwrought and becomes organic once again.
Got it.
And so I really like language that relates to those sorts of extremes because the extreme pushes up against humor. And so I tend to embrace words like that.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Because now that you say that, I can definitely see that in some of your word choices and just how you put things on the page. And in keeping with this idea of words, I wanted to ask you about the word fearless, because I definitely think you're a fearless writer. You write things that push the envelope. And I think I was most struck by, just you write things that you think and that people think, nodding to the fact that we shouldn't think or say those things out loud. And I found that kind of a recurring theme in your work, like things that are judgmental. Obviously, you wrote a book about being mean. And in Mean, there are a few passages. And just to get a flavor, I wanted to share some of these with our listeners to capture your voice. Like, for instance, you write, being mean makes us feel alive. It's fun and exciting. Sometimes it keeps us alive. And then in another place you write, I'm not so mean that I've ever raped anybody. That's a special kind of mean. And there's so much more. I will endorse this book wholeheartedly. I'm really curious to know what you think about the current state of mean given our culture right now. Like this book published in 2017, but I feel like we're meaner than we were, but maybe not. Maybe it's just the visibility of meanness. And so I wondered if I could get your take on that.
Well, I think that meanness is a tool, and tools are value neutral, right? And so a scalpel can be used to kill and a scalpel can be used to heal. And meanness is that scalpel. It can be used to prolong somebody's life and keep them alive and aid in survival. And meanness can also be used to beat somebody down and destroy them. I really think that that I value and evaluate meanness depending on how it's being deployed, right? And I think that, you know, you're alluding to the fascism that we're living under at the moment. And one of its hallmarks isn't just meanness, but it's a particular kind of crass, crude, and tacky meanness.
Right.
And there are some iterations of the tacky that I appreciate, but fascist tacky isn't one of them.
Good to know.
And so when I wrote mean and I chose that word as the memoir's title, I use that word because I think of it as very multifaceted. It has these different faces that come with different meanings, right? And so on the one hand, you have mean in terms of petty cruelty. So that's typically how people use the word mean. When they're describing a mean girl, they're referring to a girl's sort of petty acts of cruelty, right? But then there's also the notion of the mathematical mean, as in mean, median, and mode. And what I was trying to express through mean is that I don't have an experience or a lived experience that's particularly extraordinary. It's quite average. And so it kind of does reflect the mean. And then the other element of mean that's part of that title is that as a survivor of ongoing sexual violence, because I write quite a bit about these different instances of sexual violence that I survived during my youth, in the aftermath of those experiences, I had to figure out how to make meaning out of them. So I didn't want for the experiences that I had endured to be in vain. And that's, again, a really common experience among survivors. What do we do with these broken pieces? How do we put them back together? How do we move forward? And then construct some sort of meaning that inspires us to thrive and might inspire others as well. And so one monosyllabic word with 4 letters was packed with that much meaning for me.
You set me up for my question there, because your books are so multi-layered and there's so much to unpack in them, and you just definitely can't sum up what they're about in a single sentence. You do a lot of critical analysis and you make all these kind of interesting and unexpected connections in your writing, just like you did right now with the word mean. And so I'm curious to know how you know when you've landed on a subject or topic that you want to write about, and if there's an example you can pull from. We'd love an anecdote.
Sure. I know that I've arrived at a subject that impassions me when the subject becomes an intellectual obsession that fascinates me, that I can't seem to let go of, and that invites me sort of to drill down into these wormholes where I get lost researching the subject, theorizing about the subject, contemplating the subject, considering the subject, evaluating it, weighing it. And so it really does have sort of the feel of almost like a maniacal obsession, you know? And there are certain sort of like intellectual obsessions that I've nurtured for a very long time that don't seem to be declining in interest for me. For example, gender-based violence is one of those subjects. White supremacy, xenophobia, and racism are like another sort of category that moves together, that continues to sort of draw my attention and interest me. And then I'm also very interested in all things occult and esoteric and magic. And so that's been creeping into my writing much more as of late. And so I'll give an example of how that kind of intellectual obsession or passion or even like mania can fuel work. So earlier, Brooke, you were mentioning the novel American Dirt. And I wrote a critical essay about that book that went viral. And the way that that essay came into being was that I was contacted by an editor and invited to review American Dirt for Ms. Magazine. And I had reviewed books for them before. And when I received the book, I knew nothing about it. And I could tell very little about it from the cover. Like often you can tell a bit about a book by its cover, but this cover was a bit elusive. And given the title, American Dirt, for some reason, I thought it had to do with like agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good assumption.
So I was like, oh. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. They're asking me to review a novel about agricultural life, which isn't what I'm often invited to read, right? Because typically I'm sent books about racism or gender-based violence. Like people sort of know that's my wheelhouse. And so I thought, this is really different. And so I threw the book in my suitcase and I went to Mexico to stay with family during Thanksgiving. And while I was at my aunt's house in Mexico, I started reading American Dirt. And I was horrified because it was a tawdry narco thriller that wildly misrepresented Mexico, in my opinion. And as I was reading the book, I would stare at the page and read about sort of this version of Mexico that I describe as like a gringo fantasia. And then I would look up from the book and see the real Mexico. And I would return to the page. And so it was this maddening experience. And I didn't want to finish the book, but then I decided to really commit myself to it as a hate reader. Right? I was like, I'm going to hate read the shit out of this. So like, I got down to it and I was really intent on panning this book because the book seemed very pernicious to me, especially in terms of the stereotypes that it was promoting and the fact that it was going to be published and celebrated around the same time that President Donald Trump was discussing the invasion of Mexico.
Right.
And so I thought to myself, like, a book like this is going to provide fodder for his xenophobic and racist arguments, because I consider the book to be racist and xenophobic. And so I felt like it was very important for me to critique the book. And when Ms. declined to publish the review, I got pissed because I didn't believe the reason that they gave me for wanting to for their rejection. I didn't believe them. And then when I discovered that the book had been chosen by Oprah as a book club read, I felt that it was even more important to have a public discourse about the book, considering how many hands the book was going to be in. And so that's sort of an example of how I get sort of impassioned to pursue a subject and then get my thoughts in print.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And we hope your summer writing or your summer daydreaming is going well. And we hope you'll return this September, ready for a couple of our big programs. You know, we've got two big things happening, at least two big things. To start, we're offering an 8-week intensive class to get you ready to publish your memoir, from the proposal to the pitch to the query letter to actually submitting and everything in between. And we're even hosting a Pitchapalooza event with the book doctors, Ariel Eckstedt and David Henry Sterry. And that event is free and open up to our entire community. Also, of significant note, we're going to start getting ready for our second annual January story, a challenge to write 500 words of your memoir each day in January. So rest up, take a swim, enjoy the summer heat, and come back ready to write your story.